The Ukraine invasion was meant to be so simple for Russian President Vladimir Putin. His forces would march into Ukraine, take the entire country in less than a week, and finally give Putin the one decisive victory that cemented his legacy. Of course, over 3 years into what was meant to be a week-long campaign, Russia is still nowhere near winning in Ukraine. In fact, a Russian loss looms large in Ukraine, and Putin can do nothing to escape it this time. And experts are now sounding the alarm because Russia is losing this war and Putin is finally staring defeat in the face. That's according to Foreign Policy, which published an article on May 19 highlighting the many problems that Putin now faces in Ukraine. And the worst of it is that Putin has dealt with these types of issues before, only not on the scale of the Ukraine war. Russia's president has always been able to escape the optics of defeat by essentially feigning victory in circumstances that suggest a Russian loss. There are plenty of examples. Take Georgia. Russia started a small war against this much smaller state back in August 2008, fighting against Georgian troops for 16 days. Russia won that small war to an extent. However, the first signs of the cracks that are now so evident in Russia's military began to emerge even during that fight. Different divisions of Russia's military failed to work together. It was clear that Russia's military, for all of its projected power, was a legacy force inherited from the Soviet Union and seemingly no stronger than it had been 2 decades before. Putin picked up on this problem, instituting a full military reform mere months after the Georgia campaign. He changed the optics. Georgia was used as an example by Putin for how he was going to rebuild Russia's army. But look beyond those sorts of grandiose announcements and you see that Russia's victory in this war amounted to pretty much nothing. Georgia isn't part of Russia. It's still an independent state, with Putin resorting to relying on his oligarchs and exerting political pressure to raise his influence in the country. That's not the resounding victory Russia hoped for. There are similar attempts to change the optics in Syria. For years, Putin threw his support behind Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, seemingly convinced that doing so gave Russia a seat at the Middle Eastern political table. But in 2024, Assad's regime crumbled. As the Carnegie Endowment points out, Russia was unprepared for this scenario and could do little to help Assad other than provide him with an escape route to Moscow. Just as it was seen in Georgia, the illusion of Russia's power crumbled. What was meant to be a regime propped up by Putin's military might ended up crumbling in weeks once it faced a concerted rebellion. Now, Russia is pushed into a situation where it's trying to limit its Syrian losses while maintaining whatever scraps of influence it has in and around Syria. All of this is important background for why Russia is on its way to losing the war in Ukraine. Why? It demonstrates that so much of Russia's might is merely a smokescreen crafted by Putin to position his failures as victories in the eyes of those inside his country. As Foreign Policy itself points out, in none of these theatres has Putin notched a lasting success. Georgia is up for grabs and Russia's presence is fading away in Syria. Yet, Putin still acts the victor, and the exact same scenario can be seen unfolding in Ukraine. The world should have taken note of the hints. Russia's leader launched his campaign of aggression against Ukraine in 2014, and he achieved some success, annexing the Crimean Peninsula to bring it under Russian control. But he also saw plenty of failure. Putin's efforts to rely on pro-Russian paramilitary forces in Donetsk and Luhansk failed, meaning Russia ultimately didn't get to snatch up all of the Ukrainian territory it wanted. Fast forward to more than a decade later, and Putin is still trying to act as though he's succeeding in Ukraine, even though he clearly isn't. This is clear in his Victory Day parade on May 9, Foreign Policy observes. Putin's projections were such that he attempted to force a temporary ceasefire for those celebrations, which commemorate the Soviet victory in World War II. Putin used the occasion to hobnob with world leaders who are still sympathetic to Russia's cause, Chinese President Xi Jinping being the most important among them. Russian troops marched in formation through Red Square. Russia was not isolated, it had plenty of friends. It was Ukraine that would eventually falter when faced with this overwhelming might. Again, it's all optics. Putin used the parade as an attempt to convince the rest of the world that Ukraine's defeat is inevitable. The reality Russia's leader faces on the ground is much different, says Foreign Policy. Ukraine isn't some far-flung conflict like that he engaged in Syria. Ukraine also isn't Georgia. Instead, Ukraine is, and has been since Putin's initial special military operation failed, an outright disaster for Putin. A disaster so extensive that the Kremlin can no longer hide the misery Putin's failing war is causing to Russia's people. Slowly, and not yet suddenly, Russia is starting to lose the war, Foreign Policy argues. And it only takes looking through Putin's propaganda to see the evidence. Take Russia's enormous casualty rate as an example. Despite all of Putin's attempts to showcase how a Russian victory is imminent, his country is losing far more than anybody anticipated. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, Russia has now lost almost 976,000 of its soldiers to death, injury or capture since Putin launched his invasion. Compounding those horrendous troop losses are huge blows to Russia's equipment stockpiles. More than 10,800 of Russia's tanks now lie useless in the Ukrainian dirt. Russia has lost more than 28,000 artillery systems, 22,500 armored vehicles, 28 of its ships, 1 of its submarines, and over 700 of its planes and choppers. None of this was part of Putin's backup plan. When his initial invasion failed, Russia's leader was reverted to waging a war of attrition against Ukraine. The massive losses were justified in his eyes because Russia was fighting a small force. Eventually, Ukraine would bow to the pressure and Russia would overtake the entire country. Again, it was all in the optics. Only the war of attrition isn't going Putin's way. Some experts, including the Atlantic Council in March, now believe that Russia is losing the attritional war Putin himself started. It also highlights the sheer scale of Russia's losses as evidence, while pointing out that there's a long history of smaller nations turning attritional tactics against their enemies. Iran did it when fighting Iraq in the 1980s. Vietnam succeeded against the US, and the US itself turned the tables on the British Empire centuries ago. Now, Ukraine is inflicting the same kind of damage on Russia, flipping on their head the optics Putin wants to create of an overwhelming Russian force steamrolling through Ukraine. Compounding these problems are other issues that demonstrate how much weaker Russia is than Putin wants to reveal. Russia's economy is a major problem that underpins all of its military failures. As Foreign Policy notes, Putin's obsession with winning in Ukraine has damaged his country's economy to the point where the win he now desires is practically impossible. Putin was able to hide this problem when he started his war. The initial influx of work the Ukraine invasion generated sparked Russian economic growth, as it reached 5% during the early months. Now, recent reports indicate a significant slowdown in Russia's economic growth, approaching stagnation. Plus, Putin's war has overheated Russia's labor market to the point where it's dealing with inflation in the 10% region. And with a trade war between the US and China in full swing, Putin may soon face a future where falling energy prices and less trade with China destroy the last vestiges of Russia's economy. Russia's economy isn't destroyed just yet. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, made that clear in an April article. However, it also points to problems Russia will face in the future. By 2030, says CSIS, Russia will lack 2.4 million workers. The number may end up higher if Putin continues the Ukraine war. Russia is already well on track to have lost over 1 million of its people by the end of 2025, which, when combined with the country's natural population decline, spells serious problems for its future. It all adds up to current and future economic woes for Russia. As Putin finds himself needing to pour more money into its military, Russia is generating less cash and is stalled out on the economic front. The longer Putin pushes on, the worse these problems will get, turning an already damaging present into a destructive future. Compounding these problems further is Russia's political situation. All Putin can offer to his people, says Foreign Policy, is endless Putinism. That would be fine if Russia's leader were able to maintain his masquerade of victory. But Putin now finds himself in a position where he's stuck in a tight corner of political pressure, both at home and abroad, that will eventually tell on Russia's leader. At this moment, Putin is trying to dodge all of the pressure being placed on him to accept a ceasefire with Ukraine. Outwardly, Putin appears somewhat cavalier about the entire idea of a ceasefire. He's certainly acting like he's not worried about the prospect of further sanctions being placed against him if he refuses to accept. He's also made several comments about how current ceasefire terms don't satisfy Russia, suggesting he's in no rush because he believes his forces are winning the Ukraine war. But beneath this facade, he's dealing with the economic woes already mentioned, frequent pressure from the US, and constantly increasing cost of recruitment into his military. As the Jamestown Foundation highlights, these are compounding issues. A compromised peace deal would require Putin to transition from a war leader to a manager of a complex domestic crisis, it says, and he's not prepared for such a downsizing. Therein lies the corner that Putin has painted himself into. He knows that he needs to end the war to save his ailing country, yet he can't halt his invasion because doing so puts him in a position where he has to solve the problems he's created. So he keeps plugging along with his war, hoping that the compounding challenges that face Russia will go away. They won't. These issues wouldn't be so glaring for Putin if the situation were different for Russia, says Foreign Policy. If Russia were winning in Ukraine by taking massive swathes of territory, Putin could tell his people they only needed to endure a few more months of hardship before his victory delivered an economic windfall. Similarly, if Russia were on the defensive, the economic, diplomatic and internal political issues Putin has created could be forgiven. That's what's happening in Ukraine. War against Russia has hardly led to a booming economy for Ukraine, and it's losing thousands of people itself. But Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky can justify all of these problems because he and his people know that Ukraine ceases to exist if it capitulates. Putin can't do that. Instead, the veil he's so long worn has been lifted, and the world is seeing Russia for what it is, a country that's weaker than anybody thought militarily, and is now struggling under the weight of Putin's desire to maintain the illusion of victory. All of this alone might be enough to signify that Russia is on the verge of collapse in Ukraine. But Foreign Policy points out that Putin now faces two key military dilemmas that have made Russia's defeat inescapable. One of those dilemmas previously touched upon here is that Russia is struggling to advance in Ukraine. Evidence of that comes from Pokrovsk. This small city has been a target for Putin throughout much of the Ukraine war, and it's easy to see why. Pokrovsk is one of Ukraine's most important strongholds on the eastern front of the war, not least because it's a vital logistics hub Ukraine uses to keep its troops supplied in Donetsk. The city is also only around 12.4 miles away from Donetsk's administrative border. Putin wants to reach that border. He's been trying since the failed invasion of 2014 because hitting that border allows him to claim that he controls Donetsk. Yet Pokrovsk isn't any closer to falling under Russian control than it was when Putin launched his 2022 invasion. The situation has become so bad for Russia that it's now looking for ways to circumvent the city entirely rather than throwing thousands more soldiers at assaults that aren't working. Pokrovsk is a microcosm of the stalled out situation Russia faces throughout Ukraine. For instance, April saw both the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, and the UK Ministry of Defence, or MOD, published figures highlighting a steep decline in the amount of territory Russia is taking in 2024. The ISW says that Russia claimed 165 square miles of Ukraine in January, with the MOD saying it was 126 square miles. In February, Russia claimed 137 square miles of Ukraine according to ISW, or just 76 square miles according to the MOD. And it only gets worse. Russia claimed either 78 square miles or 55 square miles in March, depending on which resource you believe. Either way, these numbers showcase that Russia's advances are faltering at a time when Putin can't afford the slowdown. Bear in mind too that the March slowdown occurred during the dawning of spring, meaning the harsh weather Putin might have used to justify the low territory grabs in January and February no longer apply. The reality is that the momentum Putin claims to have is yet another of his smokescreens. The Telegraph highlighted just how bad this momentum slippage has become. Russia claimed 5 times less territory in March than it did 5 months prior, all amidst rising casualty rates. The ISW's George Barras explained the problem Russia now faces. When you continue fighting after the point in which you've been exhausted and the point at which your forces' offensive operations are culminated, you can keep fighting, but you're going to get diminishing marginal returns, he says. Your attrition rate is going to go higher, and you're just not going to be quite as effective. Pay attention to the word culminated in that quote. Barros appears to be suggesting that Putin has already thrown the best he has at Ukraine, and it hasn't worked. He's left with continuing his attacks using the dregs of Russia's military, all as the economic and manpower pressures mentioned earlier escalate. As for the second dilemma Russia faces, that one's simple: Ukraine itself. The Telegraph highlights this when talking about Russia's stalled offensives in 2025. It says that Ukraine is now in a position where it can launch counteroffensives against Russian positions in Donetsk and other regions because it's winning the attritional war. Russia's forces have grown weaker, its defenses have followed suit. Far from having the momentum he claims to have, Putin is losing ground as his gains slow down. As one NATO official told the Telegraph, "As we expected, Russian gains have slowed as they approach more built-up areas like Pokrovsk, and their casualty rates have continued to be very high. Russia has repeatedly shown that they'll continue to accept that type of strategy, high losses in exchange for slow gains." That strategy might have worked earlier in the war when Russia still had equipment and veteran soldiers. But now, when it's dealing with equipment shortages and having far less experienced soldiers in its ranks, the strategy seems increasingly dangerous, and Putin appears to have no plan B. Foreign policy also points out that Putin's Ukraine dilemma ultimately stems from the choice he made when his initial Ukraine invasion failed. Back then, Putin could have either waged a reduced war or an all-encompassing one that hit Ukraine civilians hard. He chose the latter. It's estimated that Russia's invasion has claimed the lives of at least 12,910 Ukrainian civilians between February 24, 2022 and March 31, 2025. 682 of the dead being children. A further 30,700 Ukrainian civilians have been injured by Russia's constant missile, drone and glide bomb assaults on Ukraine's cities. What Putin intended to be a terroristic campaign against Ukraine's people has backfired. His sheer brutality steeled Ukraine's resolve against Russia by convincing its people that they had to fight. If Putin's combination of attrition and terrorism was supposed to break Ukraine's resolve, he's discovered that it did the opposite. Putin himself created an enemy in Ukraine that he can't defeat. Instead, he pushed Ukraine deeper into the arms of its Western allies than ever before, while creating the environment in which Ukrainian innovation has caused so many of Russia's losses. Now, Putin is left relying on others to save his failed war. If the US were to withdraw support from Ukraine, for instance, that might allow Russia to claim victory. But given the recent signing of a minerals deal between Ukraine and the US, which seems to be accompanied by the US reasserting its support of Ukraine, that possibility seems unlikely. Again, this is all Putin's fault. As Foreign Policy observes, Russia's leader took what was a potentially sympathetic Trump administration and pushed it past its breaking point with his constant refusals to adhere to a ceasefire. The US isn't going to come to Putin's rescue. That leaves him with a military campaign that's floundering amidst massive casualty rates, stalled momentum, and a resurgent Ukraine. Combine that with the economic and political problems Putin has created for himself at home, and it's no longer a case of if Russia is going to lose the Ukraine war. It's when. All Putin can do now, Foreign Policy says, is continue with the Putinism that took him this far. He'll appeal to an increasingly unhappy Russian population to trust him, even as all of the evidence for an inevitable Russian loss stacks up. If Russia's people start to show hints of rebellion, Putin may be forced into creating a police state, the outlet suggests. That isn't happening yet, but it could be the last desperate resource of a man who realizes that the optics he so carefully creates aren't showing what he wants them to show. Putin's role as Russia's authoritarian, which has long been his strength, is now morphing into his biggest weakness. After all, Putin built his authority by projecting an image of strength to his people. The Ukraine war has shattered that image, leaving Putin to think seriously about what comes next, if only to save his own skin. Russia's leader knows his time is short. After 25 years of ruling Russia, Putin is now on the hunt for a successor to either carry on his work or, more likely, shoulder the responsibility for fixing a devastated Russia when he's gone. He supposedly has a list of potential successors. He's even begun to speak about what that successor needs to be able to do, stating that they will have to earn the trust of the people or they have no chance to do anything seriously. Perhaps Putin just gave the game away. He knows he's losing, and in some cases has already lost that trust. Now he's looking for an escape plan so he doesn't have to be stuck in one of his presidential palaces when Russia starts to burn around him. But what do you think about the collapse of Putin's war plan? Has Ukraine proven that Russia is little more than a paper tiger that can't get the job done under Putin? Is there any way for Russia to reverse the damage the last 3 years have done to the country? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more up-to-date news and information covering the latest in the Ukraine war, the Middle East, and other military conflicts around the globe.